With me today is none other than Janaki Severy. Janaki is the principal owner of Managing Dynamics, and she is known as a people development champion. And Janaki's company, Managing Dynamics, was founded in 1999. She supports her individual and organizational clients through training, coaching, and working with teams. She's excellent at gaining trust and encouraging possibility thinking, and builds long-term relationships with her clients. Janaki also works with individuals in life, spiritual, and wellness coaching. As an intuitive and a skilled empath, she brings unique insights to her clients. And in addition, she is a national trainer in emotional intelligence and gifted in interpersonal skills. She's been a coach of mine for years, but more importantly, she is a dear, dear friend. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you. It's really good to be here. I have not missed one summit. I'm so excited, and it's good to see all your photos. I hope you're back there listening, but if not, you can pick up the recording, so no problem. What have we been talking about today? We're actually talking about human beings. And why are we all here? Because we feel compelled to share, to expand, to offer something of ourselves and to make a difference, whether it's with our own individual families or our communities. And that is the nature of the human being. Humans connect by stories. Every time I hear Lee's story, I love it. I mean, she tells a story of transforming with this, like, I'm going to use my terms, like innocuous action to help people buy insurance. And that story is amazing. So what I'm going to talk about in the next 25-ish or 30 minutes, you also can go onto your chat and get my 2 handouts. It says Me to Everyone, and it says How to Tell a Great Story. And there's 2 handouts. So I want to talk about this first, and then I want to ask you to bring some paper, because I'd like you to start kind of thinking about your story, and you'll see what I mean in a minute, because I'm going to share some handouts. First and foremost, when we meet someone, after the formal introduction, and if it's from someone to someone, we normally share a bit about them, like Bettina did about me. At a social event, there's usually some, why are you here? How'd you get here? Who do you know? At a restaurant or someplace where it's literally 2 strangers, have you eaten here before? Have you been to this town? Are you traveling? So we use story to establish some sort of connection. And people like people who are like them. So the moment we lean into a story, it's when it feels familiar, or the circumstances feel familiar, or you are someone I can connect to. Therefore, I'm interested in your story because you feel a little bit like me, and maybe I have a similar story. So I want us to all be thinking about whether or not you've written your book, or whether or not you're going to write your book. What might your story be? And so there are some components that I want you to be aware of. So I'm going to screen share. I hope everyone can see these. If anyone can't, please let me know. So when you want to tell a story, you want to think about, what is your message? Who is my audience? Am I telling it in a social event where I'm networking for business? So is that my 90-second commercial? Am I telling it to an audience from the front of the stage? And I'm an atopical speaker, meaning I spoke at the Washington Finance Conference for 6 years as the only non-finance speaker. And I spoke on things like communication, team building, memory, etc. And so my first out of the gate after I was introduced was to establish value. And I usually had 100 to 150 to 200 people in the audience, because it was different than finance and they were curious. But I had to connect it to me and to them. So when you start with your message, it has to flow from these questions. What is the message I want to share? And why? Why do I want to share it? What's important is that you tell stories about your experience. That you cannot get wrong. Sometimes people tell stories about someone else, and then you have to deal with permission, you have to deal with getting it wrong, and your perception of their story may not be the same that your listening audience might have. So if you tell your own experience, then you're vivacious, you're connected, you can answer questions, you're engaged, it matters to you. And so that becomes the part that the person who's listening gets connected to. your enthusiasm, your aliveness, your revealing of something that maybe they never knew or suspected about you, or that was very unique in the world. And you're going to give this talk or write a book about this unique experience. So you make this your own experience and you tell it in such a way that people feel very connected to it and they feel connected to you in the telling. One of the things that's important when you're telling a story is that you resist being the hero. And what do I mean by that? When we're telling a story, it has a lot of I's in it. I did this, I did that, I did this. And that's natural because it's a story. But sometimes if we're not a little bit cautious, it can sound so full of us that people can't see themselves in it. So you want to make the story global enough that although you're the central figure, the events that are happening could happen to a lot of people. Like you're telling a story about helping a child overcome something. And if in that you talk about how many things we overcome in life, how many things you've overcome, who this child was and why they're important to you, why you want them to overcome this, who you are to them, then the story becomes very rich. It has lots of components. And then I, as the audience, think about, oh, are there children I could help? Or maybe, I'm going to remember who helped me. Maybe this will have me write a book about my grandparents who helped me. And because of what they did, I am now this person. So as you're in the audience, start thinking about, are there stories that you probably are already telling to people you care about? They're the ones where in a conversation you say, oh, this changed my life. Or, oh, gosh, when that happened, I saw the world entirely differently. And those are the stories, because they impacted you. One, you have lots of color and you have lots of memory, lots of detail. And so it's important that the story you tell is emotionally connected to you. It's not a flat repeat. It's actually got a lot of high conversation tone, a lot of rich description, a lot of connection. In that story, you want to highlight some kind of struggle. I don't know how many of you know this, but I'm a drama major. That was my first degree. And in theater, we study themes. We study man against himself, man against man, man against nature, man against a struggle, man against God, man against commitments. So there are large themes that the human experience lives in, and they usually involve struggle. And that is what defines us. It is the struggle, which will always happen, is common to all of us. The definition of who you are is how you rose to, responded to, walked through, worked toward changing this struggle so that it became something meaningful for you and didn't completely devastate you. So when you have this struggle, you want to be able to talk about it in a way that the audience can connect to it, but not so much detail that they will feel overwhelmed and not be able to see how they connect. It's like when you go to a social event and someone starts telling you something that you're pretty interested in, and pretty soon they've taken it down to something so minute in the topic that it's smaller than you are capable of following because you don't know the topic that well. So when you tell your story, tell enough to keep people engaged so that no one's left out because it's too technical. And that happens a lot with speakers as well. People who are giving technical talks will very frequently give more information than the audience needs, and it'll shut them down. So the brain is very interesting. The brain likes to listen at a certain rhythm and have a certain amount of interest to keep it engaged. If we talk too fast and we go like this, then the brain gets really tired. It shuts down because it just can't keep up with you because you're talking too fast. And if you talk really slow, the brain also shuts down because it's so boring. And that can happen in a story. I've read books that at the beginning sounded so interesting, and then I realized about 3 to 4 pages in that every story was so detailed, every breath a person took, I was exhausted trying to get the theme of the story. So highlight your struggle, make sure it's something that people can relate to. And it's okay to say this is hard. People like knowing it's hard because if they can relate to it and you could do it, maybe you're the least likely person to climb that mountain. Or maybe you're 85 and you take up yoga and you go to senior yoga training and you become the world-class senior yoga trainer at 90. That's a big story, contrary to a 20-year-old taking yoga. So in this struggle, there also has to be some sense of an embedded message. It can be, you can do it, I did it. It can be, anyone can do it. It can be things like this are important, like helping people recover from trauma or helping a child feel good about themselves when somebody was unkind to them. We all have moments where we need somebody that can step in and help us. And maybe your story is when someone stepped in and helped you and what that allowed you to do or how that allowed you to be changed. It's also important to keep it simple. And by simple, the language has to be comfortable for the audience. If it's too sophisticated, too many jargon words, too much industry words, they will shut down. And if it's not interesting, it will shut down. So emotion, minute details that give the feeling for something, but not so much I get lost, are really, really important in you telling your story. Also, practicing your story. A lot of times we have it in our experience, but when we first try and communicate it, it's not well formed to transition to someone else. We can see it in our head. We lived through it. We know, we have the movie. But am I trying to communicate a movie to you? That's very, very different. There are exercises in training and development where people actually are given small pieces of a puzzle that are not really easy to connect because they have flat edges like geometric pieces. And the person in the front of the room has their back to the audience, reading description directions, how they can put the pieces together in the correct shape. Should it end up in a triangle, in a rectangle? And the skill is being able to translate how to do it with words. So storytelling is being able to translate your experience with words that they can feel or sense or understand. Keeping in mind that everyone will hear your story differently, so it will be a little bit of a different interpretation, but overall they feel, okay, I can connect. One of my favorite stories that someone told was from a professional speaker. She was very, very tall. She comes across the stage at National Speakers Association. She was a comedian. And she walks a little oddly, but fine. But she seemed like her gait was, there was something not quite right, but I couldn't figure it out. So she gets to the podium and she says, I want to talk about what it's like to be 6'1". So of course, the book she wrote was about being 6'1". But this micro moment of her story was, let's talk about nylons. Now, maybe you don't wear nylons anymore, but there was a period of time where any woman who was trying to be some kind of in the know, cool dresser wore nylons. And the nylons, were one nylon, like leggings. They weren't back in the day when you had garters. And she said, when you're 6'1", the nylons are never long enough. Even the long are never long enough. She said, the reason I'm walking this way is because they fall down and they wrap around my hips and I can't get a good gait. So I always try and wear pants to hold them up. But if they're short enough, they can even yank on my pants. So here's this woman telling this story about female clothes that are supposed to be great, that she wants to wear, but because of her body. So I don't know how many of you could raise your hand if I said, how many of you have at least one body issue that bothers you, that has affected you, that has made you shop specifically or not wear something or not go somewhere because of what they'd asked you to wear. So this was her story about her long legs. So the audience laughed hysterically. And then she said, in my book, I have all the things I've learned from other people about being tall or their height or their body. And so she took the story from her direct experience of being tall and awkward and things were difficult, to the stories of people carried about their body. And so everybody ran about the book because everybody had a body and everybody wanted to know. So it's great. It's a great metaphor. So also this practicing making perfect, tell your story, think about who you can tell. The reason is sometimes you can tell it to a close friend and you do have private humor. And the way you tell it to that close friend, it totally works for the two of you. It might be teasing language. It might be a little self-deprecating. And so they know that you're not putting yourself down, but you say like, as you know, I have issues about my feet or something like that. But if you're telling it to the larger audience, you have to audience proof it for a stranger because they don't know you. They're just reading the story without any relationship to you. So they're going to read it looking for the words you use as the connection and the feeling of the experience that they also can connect to. So if your words and the feeling aren't something they can relate to, the story won't work for them. That's why you tell your story a lot. You tell it to friends, you tell it to strangers, whatever amount of your story you want to tell, and start doing little storytelling testing to see kind of how people seem to be more enjoying it. What is the way that they seem to really like how it's explained? It makes me think of in England and back in the day where they had courts, they had people who were the storytellers of the court. Sometimes they were called bards, sometimes they were just storytellers, but they sang and told the story of the king and the victory and what just happened. And if they told it wrong, if the king didn't like it, they got killed because the words they used were not how the king wanted his story told. So clearly they had not story-proofed the story with the king. And although maybe the audience laughed or thought it was a great description, if the king didn't like it, that was the end of that. Not only was that story never told, you were not around to tell any story at all. So make sure your story is never going to do anything that offends the audience. Even if it's your truth, don't be so specific, because what is something you could share about recovering from addiction or about having had a sexual aggressive act, maybe they can't receive that much information. And so sometimes we have to be a little bit mindful of what your target audience can receive. Even though you have more to tell and more detail, they cannot hold that. So if you look at these principles, the bottom, do consider your audience. Choose a framework and details that resonate with your listeners, because ultimately you're writing a book to sell it, to share it, to give to the world in a way that your personal story is uniquely capable of doing. Identify the moral or the message you want to impart, and find inspiration so that when you talk about it, when people ask you about it, it remains a beautiful story for you. Don't assume you are a good storyteller, because we all have to have some practice. And don't assume the story that's interesting to you is interesting to everyone else. Remember not to give yourself the starring role, because then no one can see themselves in the story because you're so giant in it that they will compare themselves to you and say, well, I'm not that person. What you want them to say is, oh my gosh, if you could do it, I could do it. But if the you who's doing it is so bigger than life, they're going to possibly get intimidated. And then don't overwhelm people with unnecessary details. So I'm going to stop at this point and just ask, does anybody have any stories? Because the next section, I'm going to have you actually write an idea that you want to write about your own story, just to kind of play with it. So does anybody have any questions? Okay.
I have a question.
Oh, great.
Hi, it's Debbie.
Hi.
Janaki, I think you're brilliant. Thank you so much for all that you share.
Thank you.
I mean, truly.
Thank
So
you.
it's interesting. You're saying, so much about marketing is about finding your target audience. And I've been taught in that realm that means to be really authentic. And that means that some people are just not going to like you and some people are going to love you. You got to find your tribe.
Yeah.
So when you say, being on stage and I get everything you're saying about, offending people or whatever, but what is that delineation when you are actually looking for the tribe, the audience that is really resonating with what your message is? Or are you speaking about, I'm speaking on a huge global scale first, and I want to appease to everybody versus your tribe?
Well, I just, first, I love your question. First and foremost, there's two ways you can do it. You can identify your tribe. So you're in health and wellness. So, and I know yours is so specific, and you and I resonate completely on how you see that. And I love your book. So just accolades to you back. You could go to people who are already there, people who have nutrition preferences, people who are in comprehensive alternative medicine, people who have audiences of books that you would read that you think that audience would like my book. And so you could market to the audience that you know already receives it. But many of us want to expand our audience. We want to go beyond the audience because we truly believe this will be helpful for people that have not quite understood this. That's where, to your point, it gets tricky. So oftentimes when you're dealing with reaching the audience, let's say you're presenting your book and you're doing a talk piggybacked off the book, you would say to the person you're securing the gig with, I help people understand other kinds of health. So it's important that when I give you my promo, that you print it in that way so people can self-select not to come. So when I was with Washington finance officers, I had there were 800 attending, and the room only held 155 to 175, and the room was full every time. But I made it very clear in my description that this is not about finance, it's really about people, and it's really about you. And I actually developed a little following because they knew my style, and you have a beautiful style as well. So there's two things. One, market to the audience you know already likes and believes what you do, and you're another remarkable new version and maybe a better one from what they have. And then two, figure out how to open your market by moving into segue markets that will allow you to be an interesting new speaker because your topic is different. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. I do see the delineation between essentially the two different audiences, or the styles to the two different audiences. One, you're expanding to those who maybe they don't really get what you're saying right now. So I get everything you're saying is to be kind of be safe with them, resonate with them. Yeah. And not being the hero is really an interesting, I'm taking notes. Okay, Janaki.
Well, for example, I did a lot of work with national speakers, and I was asked to work with the wives of construction people, large scale developers. So I didn't know the audience. I mean, who are the wives of people who do big scale development? I mean, they're everybody. They're you, they're me, they're somebody else. And I did it on creativity, and we had a meditation. And in the meditation, I laid out lots of permission. I'm just going to take you on a journey. Let me describe what it is. I didn't take them 20 minutes into description, so they knew. I think it's really helpful to close your eyes, but you don't have to. And if you don't want to do this, just relax and just listen to the music. And if you don't want to listen to my voice, you can just kind of go into an inner journey. Well, 3 women, and this was quite a while ago, came up to me and said that they didn't appreciate me trying to brainwash them. Now, I could have fallen off the stage, like my Freeman, like, what? I mean, it was something like, pick 6 colors and which one are you drawn to? And that color may have energy for you. I mean, there was no God, there was no devil, but they felt very uncomfortable. So I said to them, I'm so glad you recognize when you don't feel safe. Were you able to just ignore me and be comfortable in the room? And they said, well, yes, we did. And I said, congratulations, nice boundary setting. So I couldn't, you know what I'm saying? I couldn't react to them, and I didn't want to shame them. And I was surprised because I thought I'd covered all the bases. And there you go. Another person, I was talking about other health components, and I talked about Ayurveda, and that you can take a pulse, and that the person takes a pulse and measures whether you're Pitta, Vata, or Kapha. And I said, it's from India. It's one of the many ways that people experience health. Well, I was talking about health and other ways of knowing. A man stayed after. He was very religious, Christian. I say no criticism there. But he asked me if I was in a cult. And I said, no. And he said, well, why are you talking about people touching you and that aren't Christian? And I said, I'm so glad that you are scanning for the energy company to make sure all the speakers are well vetted. I said, do you believe in Christ? And he said, yes. And I said, my understanding is that Christ was very open to understanding all ways. And so I try and understand all ways. Are you comfortable with that? And then he let it go. So why am I saying that? That even if we think we've really made it pristine, there will be just that person who hears it through
Filters.
a filter that helps them want to protect themselves from what they think it is. And that's why the hero can be a problem, or the words you use. So I love you asking. And I've had the most interesting questions. And my biggest two things: honor the courage it takes to ask the question, and honor that the questions come from protecting themselves, from wanting to feel safe with these words they just heard that make them uncomfortable. So I give them all the power and acknowledge and compliment them for being so cautious and careful, and to please come back and feel free to ask me anytime how I can further explain things. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Janaki.
You're welcome. So if you want any more questions before I go into another quick share. So I'm just going to show you what this is. I see my time is almost up, but I want you to just be aware that this is also in the chat. If you wanted to play with your story, and you can have many, many stories, the first high point would be the wonderful thing in your life that's happening now, because people lean into what's good. If you tell the horrible thing first or the scary thing first, people can go, oh, that's too much. I can't take that. So it's like, my life is good. My life is wonderful. Here's all the great things I'm doing. And then, the mess. But it wasn't always that way. And the way you tell the mess, to your point, Debbie, is exactly to that audience. If it's teenagers, you tell the mess differently than if it's 50-year-old, very experienced women. If it's people with PhDs in neuropsychology, you tell it very differently than people who have a different kind of education and are not really comfortable with brain science. And then you tell the turning point. What was your rock bottom? And even the rock bottom you tell has to be cautious. Because if I go into how I was sexually blah, 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 and I give too much detail, I can lose everybody in the horror of my experience. So it has to be gently shared enough to help them know how painful it was, but not so much that they relive it and feel it's too much for them to even read the book. And then the moment you knew something needed to change, like if I had had an abusive situation, I might say, for years, this man was unkind, disrespectful, and would be sometimes even physically abusive. And I realized that it wasn't going to stop. And after 10 years, I decided that I needed to do something because he was not going to change. Now, that's a fairly safe rock bottom flip. Then what was the positive outcome that happened? Well, you might say, and who knew that when I had this experience and I left this man, and I would quietly tell my female friends that this relationship had been difficult, they would say to me, oh, me too. I also was abused. And so the turning point was, I wasn't alone. My voice needs to be heard. Other women need to know you can leave and it will be okay. And you will survive and thrive. So then the story behind you discovering it in that case might be that that's the story. You decided to help other women, give them permission to leave. And the achievement seeding is, and I want you, who wants to be in my women's group, who wants to take the word out, who wants to pass out this flyer of where people can get help. And so these kinds of things are things that if you wanted to tell a story, you can play with those. And then what you can do is find somebody who loves and adores you no matter what, and say, I'm thinking about writing a book and I want to give you my little outline, but act like you don't know me. And you know my story, but act like you don't know me. Am I sharing enough that you get it without sharing so much that I'm making you feel uncomfortable or it's too personal? So any questions? Yes, I will reshare the documents right now. Okay. So any questions? Well, awesome. I'm going to stay on for just a minute and reshare the documents. And it's so nice to be here again, Bettina. I adore you, as you know. And if anybody wants to reach me afterwards, you are welcome to reach me through Bettina, or my email is janakis@msn.com. And I'm going to put these in chat again right now because I had to take them off the desktop. So bear with me, please.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Janaki. Of course, what you don't know is that I use some of your storytelling procedures, advice, wisdom, sage advice at that this morning to be able to speak into the speaking that I did today.
Great.
And I had uncovered a 8-part formula, which we didn't go too deep into, with a speech that I helped Barbara Ozeda write, who was in the audience earlier, maybe still is here. Oh, there she is. And I was like, this stuff works, you know, and to tell a story in a manner where you're able to inspire, motivate, you know, folks with your story, it can be very, very powerful. And thank you so much for your presentation. And you just dropped the documents into the chat. If anybody wants to get those that is watching on YouTube or on Facebook, even later from today, where would they contact you to get those?
My email is my first name and my last initial. You can see it on the screen. It's Janaki S, JANAKIS @msn.com. My website is managingdynamics.com, so you could contact me there. And my phone number, which is also a text, is 206-478-7173. Thank you, Janet, for putting my website in the chat. Appreciate that. Go, Janet.
Yes, gotta love it. Gotta love Janet. Janet's working behind the scenes as our project manager.